Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and thank you for joining both in person and in the sites all over the world. So let me just talk a little bit about myself by way of introduction, and then I'll talk about the book. I'm a physician by training, and then I did academic public health training as well, as Chris mentioned. And it was sometimes I'm asked how long it took me to write this book, and the answer is 20 years. No, it didn't actually take 20 years to write a book. The book took about 6 months, but it builds on about 20 years worth of thoughts and experience in the field. And really, the earliest motivation for this book came from when I was working in Somalia, which Chris mentioned I was doing with Doctors Without Borders. And I was very much doing sort of hands-on clinical work day to day and helping people and helping people and helping people. And while I was there, I couldn't help but feel like I was the proverbial guy on the side of the river pulling somebody out of the river because she's drowning, and then jumping in, pulling out somebody else because he's drowning, and then jumping in, pulling somebody else out of the river because she's drowning, but never stopping for a second and saying, who is throwing them in the river to begin with? And recognizing that, I think I started my path down this road over the past 20 years, trying to better understand what is it that really causes health? How is it that I can go upstream and understand what drives health so that we can keep people healthy for as long as possible? And what this book tries to do is it tries to say what causes health and how do we change the conversation on health so that we can actually create a healthier world. Because at the end of the day, I talk to audiences all the time, blue audiences, red audiences, purple audiences, and it's very clear that we all care about health. We may disagree on any number of values, but all over the world, everybody would like to be healthy as possible, would like their children to be as healthy as possible, and would like to see their children grow up and get married, and them being healthy as possible. So the book is called, well, what we need to talk about when we talk about health, because I've become convinced that at the end of the day, we need a different conversation on health, and we need to talk about health differently in such a way that it changes how we approach health. So I'm going to show you a couple of data slides that frames the issue, starting from the point of why our health is not as good as it should be. Now I'm going to make this a US-centered presentation, the first part of it, just because I'm focusing on US data, but I'm happy to talk about it in the global context afterwards. But let me then move on to this first question, which is really, what is wrong with our health? Like if I'm here telling you that we need to talk about our health differently, it's reasonable to ask me, well, there must be something wrong with our health, otherwise the way we're talking about our health is just fine. So let me show you one simple slide that captures that, which is this. So this is death from non-communicable diseases, which is things like cancer and heart disease. And what you see here is a number of high-income countries. You have Japan, Spain, Italy, Norway, Sweden, and the United States is in red. Now this is one slide, one data slide, but I could show you, I could spend the next half an hour showing you data slide after data slide that makes this exact same point. Essentially that health indicators in the United States are worse than they are in all other high-income countries. It's consistent on life expectancy, consistent on mortality rate, and it's consistent across all age groups. Just to make that point, so what this graph is looking at age groups on the x-axis. So you see, you go from left to right, you're starting with newborns and infants and children, young adolescents, older adolescents, young adults, older adults. And you see two things on this graph. So first of all, you see a U-shaped curve, and this is mortality. So the U-shaped curve makes sense because the healthiest years of life are young adulthood. So late adolescence, young adulthood is when people die the least. So that makes sense. But then I want you to look at the blue bar and the red bar. The blue bar is our mortality in the US, and the red bar is all other high-income countries. And what you see is that the blue bar is higher than the red bar at every age group. So in the US context, we are consistent in that we kill more infants, newborns, infants, children, young children, early adolescents, late adolescents, young adults, middle-aged adults at every age group. So in some respects, the US is consistent that way in that it has worse health than all its peer countries consistently. Now, I find that well-informed, educated audiences tend to know this, that there is a bit of a sense that American health is not all it's cracked up to be, and in audiences like this one, which are sort of well-read audiences, you typically tend to have a sense of, well, we understand that this is actually becoming a challenge in all high-income countries, and this is a problem, and we tend to approach this problem with a bit of a shrug, I find. Like, yeah, we're just not so good at health. But I think that approach is incorrect, and we need to be cognizant of something that is sort of quite important, which is it was not always like this. That actually this decrement in health is a relatively recent phenomenon. So this is a graph going back the past almost 40 years now, from 1980 on. And this is life expectancy. So this is how long people can expect to live. And what you see is the red dot is the US, and the gray dots are other high-income countries. So as recently as 1980, which is 35 to 40 years ago, the US life expectancy was actually in the top half of all high-income countries. And you see that over the past 35 years, it has drifted to the bottom. So what we have come to accept with a bit of a shrug, which is that our health is worse than other high-income countries, that our health is not what it should be, wasn't always like that. And in fact, it is a set of conditions that we have created that has brought it here. Because I would ask you this, what has changed in the past 40 years? Certainly our genetics have not changed. So it must be the rest of the set of conditions around us that ultimately are driving what's making our health worse than it was as recently as 35 to 40 years ago. Now, to be optimistic, from a glass half full point of view, if we've made our health worse in the past 35, 40 years, we can certainly make it better if we understand what makes our health worse and reverse it. As this has happened, as the US life expectancy has sort of trundled along, many countries have passed us. So this shows Japan and Singapore and Chile and Costa Rica have passed the US in life expectancy. It's, for example, not well understood in the US that Slovenian life expectancy is higher than it is in the US. Not just that, in life expectancy in Slovenia is actually higher than the life expectancy of the state in the US with the highest life expectancy, which is, by the way, Hawaii. So Hawaii is the place you want to be if you want to live the longest. I don't know if people are in Hawaii who are watching this digitally. But even Hawaii has life expectancy that is less than Slovenia, not to mention the states that are then in the lower half. So we have, as a country, created worse health than all other countries. Now, you might say, well, maybe we don't care about health. You know, I started at the beginning by saying that health is a universal value, that we care about health, and it's reasonable for you to say, well, maybe we don't care so much about health. Maybe it's okay. Maybe it's okay that American health is doing worse, and maybe we're willing to accept that. But I would argue that the evidence suggests that's not true. We're not willing to accept that because we are more and more beginning to recognize this. This is our life expectancy compared to other countries, and what you see is the blue bar is when we were gaining on life expectancy. You see that until about the late 80s? And the red bars are we've been losing on life expectancy. So we were gaining, and now we've been consistently losing. And you say, well, okay, that's fine, it's how it is, and you know, there are other things, we have other priorities. But that's not what the data suggest. This is the money that we throw at the problem. So the green bar is our spending on health. The other gray lines that are very faint are other countries, and the blue line is the average of other high-income countries. So what you see is we are spending 40% more on the next closest competitor on health, and the slope of change is steeper than other countries. So right now, the US health economy is $3.3 trillion. 1 in 8 Americans work in health, which is a higher ratio than any of these other countries. So we are spending far more money than all other countries, and we are getting much less out of it. And sometimes the challenge I pose audiences, which I'll pose to the audience both here in person and digitally, name one other sector where we spend 40% more than our next closest competitor and where our indicators are worse. Let me ask you this question. Would any of you own a US-made smartphone if it cost 40% more and it performed 40% less? Well, you wouldn't. Would we own a car? Would you own a house? Like, we actually would not accept that kind of transaction in anything else, but somehow we accept it on health. So the argument is, we shouldn't accept this. This is wrong. This is simply wrong, and it should be unacceptable. And the reason it's not unacceptable, which is the premise of the book, is that we have not wrapped our brain around thinking about health properly. That to make this unacceptable, we need to start thinking about health in the right way. This is one last slide to talk about the problem and comparing the US to other high-income countries. And this slide, this is perhaps my favorite slide. If you were to take anything from this presentation and you want to take one slide and take it to a bar when you're talking to your friends to sort of start arguments, there's this one slide. And there are two axes. On the x-axis, you have life expectancy. I apologize, you have spending. On the y-axis, you have life expectancy. So what you see with all the gray bars is that as we spend more, you get more, right? You spend more, higher life expectancy. All the other countries follow that path. But look at the US. The US falls off the curve because we spend more and we get less out of it. So I feel like this one picture ultimately tells you what you need to know, is that we are spending more and getting less. And we're doing that in a way that is in contrast with everything else, every other sector in our economy. And we seem to be doing it in the sector of our economy which matters the most, at least from a sheer volume point of view. $3.3 trillion a year, 1 in 8 Americans work in this business that delivers less and costs us more. So, having said that, and having made the argument that we should be talking about health differently in order to deal with this problem, the thesis of the book is what we need to talk about when we talk about health. And the book has 20 chapters in it. They're all brief, digestible chapters. And what I wanted to do here is just talk about 3 of them. I'm just going to tell you about 3 of the chapters and three of the things that we need to talk about when we talk about health that I think can remedy this sorry state of affairs. Number one is perhaps the most important one, which is we need to be talking about health and not talking about healthcare. Now, I suspect it's one of those statements that I'm making that everybody watching is nodding and thinking to themselves, yeah, okay, I get it. But before I even tell you how to talk about it, I'm going to pose a challenge to you all. Next time you have a dinner party or you're at a bar with friends, start a conversation about health. You can do anything you want. You can say, I went to a talk and I heard something about health. And as you do that, take out your watch so you can look at the time. And see how long it takes anybody in the conversation to use the words healthcare instead of health. And I promise you, it'll take less than 5 minutes. Always happens. Within 5 minutes, somebody will say healthcare when instead they mean health. And I'm giving you that challenge to illustrate how much we conflate the two, how much we conflate health and healthcare. Now, let me explain why this matters so much. I'll start with this. This is a story of a blues man. For any of you who are watching or in the audience who like the blues, you'll recognize Blind Willie Johnson. Blind Willie Johnson is recognized one of the blues greats. We don't have many of his songs. I think we have about 36 of his songs that are recorded. He was born in Texas at the turn of the 20th century, which is 1900s, and he was born sighted. And the story is that when he was 7, his stepmother threw lye in his face in a domestic violence incident, and he became blind, hence Blind Willie Johnson. He grew up poor, black, blind, Texas. He learned how to play the guitar, and he made a living busking on street corners, which, as you can imagine, is not a particularly good living. He got married. Him and his wife were living in a house. The house burned down, and they didn't have any money, so they actually, when the fire settled, they went back and they lived in the husk of the burnt-out house. When he was 40, he developed malaria, which now we're dealing with the 1940s Texas. Malaria was not uncommon. He developed malaria, and his wife took him to hospital, and he was turned away from hospital, and then he died. And it's not clear if he was turned away because he was poor, because he was blind, or because he was black. Now, I tell you this story to ask a very simple question, which is, what killed Blind Willie Johnson? Well, what killed him was malaria. Right? He went to hospital, he had malaria, he did not get treated, then he died. So what killed him was malaria. Had he received treatment for his malaria, he would have lived. Had he received chloroquine, he would have lived. But the reason I tell that story, and it's an extreme story intentionally, is because it's pretty clear that it wasn't just malaria that killed Blind Willie Johnson, right? It was also homelessness and poverty and racism and access to care and domestic violence. All these forces also killed Blind Willie Johnson, and it's hard to avoid them when you're faced with a story like that. So the difference between health and healthcare is what we do when we get malaria. It's treating our malaria. And I want to be very clear, this is not an anti-healthcare argument, not at all. This is not an anti-medicine argument. When I have malaria, I want to be treated properly. When you have malaria, you want to be treated properly. This simply says that healthcare, treating malaria, is different than what causes health. And what causes health is everything else. It's housing, it's economic opportunity, it's education, it is domestic violence or lack thereof, it is access to care, it is racism, social supports. That's ultimately what causes health. And that's the difference between health and healthcare. And the fundamental reason why our health is terrible despite our investment is because, as I said, we spend $3.3 trillion and we're spending that all on malaria. Now, not malaria per se, I'm using malaria as a metaphor. We're spending it all on treating people who are already sick rather than spending enough of it on the other pillars that generate health. So the number one thing that we need to talk about is health, not healthcare. We need to talk about how it is that we generate health so that we can collectively invest in what generates health, not just in healthcare, not just in what cures disease. This is just a simple way now of showing this graphically, just with data. The bar on the left shows roughly what causes health. The bar on the right shows what we spend our money on. So if you look at the bar on the left, the green bar, which is access to care / medicine, most experts suggest that that causes about 5 to 10% of our health. Genetics, maybe 20%. Our environments, where we live, our social interactions, our physical environments, 20, 25%. Our behaviors, our eating, our drinking, our sleeping, our smoking, 30 to 40%. And the orange is sort of a bit of both, a bit of everything else. But the key here is the mismatch between the bar on the left and the bar on the right. All our spending is on the green, which is medicine and healthcare. But the green causes 5 to 10% of health. So healthcare versus health is the fundamental tension that ultimately underlies why our health is not as good as it should be. And it is at core, if I were to be asked, and I'm often asked, what's the one thing you would do? It is to change our national conversation so that we understand that malaria matters. But if we're only treating malaria, blind Willie Johnson is still going to die because he may be saved from his malaria today, but tomorrow he's going to have pneumonia, or the day after he's going to die from sepsis. So treating the malaria alone doesn't do it. Second argument, we choose to be healthy much less than we think. Now, one of the counter arguments I get to the first one is, okay, health, not healthcare, fine. I get it. I get that housing and economic opportunity and poverty and employment, I get that those things matter for health. But at the end of the day, I may be charitable and I might care for people who are disadvantaged. Blind Willie Johnson had a hard life, but you know what? I can choose to live a good life. I've pulled myself up by the bootstraps. I can choose to be healthy. And as long as I choose to be healthy, surely I'm going to be okay. And this is a mistake that we make all the time. And in fact, if you go to a physical bookstore, I know we're here at Google, which means the physical world is a thing of the past, but you can go to a digital bookstore, you'll find the same thing. There are two kinds of books about health. There are shelves and shelves of books that tell you about how you can choose to be healthy, how you can choose to eat better, to exercise more, to sleep more. And then you have shelves and shelves of books that tell you, well, if that doesn't work, here's a pill for you. Those are roughly the two kinds of books. One is how you can choose to be healthy, and the other one is, well, if that doesn't work, let's give you a pill, let's give you a drug, let's treat your malaria. That paradigm suggests that we think that we can choose to be healthy and that ultimately our choice of health is within our hands. Now, I know you're thinking, well, but isn't it? So let me just use a metaphor to illustrate how it's not. And I'll go to sort of a well-known health movie, The Devil Wears Prada. So Devil Wears Prada, for those of you who have not seen it, is a movie about a fearsome fashion editor who's played in the movie by Meryl Streep, and The Intern, who's played by Anne Hathaway. And it's a lovely story of an odd couple who eventually come to understand each other and all that. But there's a great scene, which is the scene which is on the right, which is where Andy is, the intern, is wearing a sweater, this sweater here. And the scene is where there is a conversation between her and the editor around where the editor is trying to choose one of two belts. And Andy, the intern, who thinks she's bigger than that, laughs at the absurdity of the choice, thinking, well, the two belts look exactly the same. And the editor, Miranda, decides to sort of take her down one notch and says, well, look at the sweater you're wearing. You think you chose that sweater, didn't you? But what you don't know is that that sweater is not turquoise, it's not blue, it's not lapis, it's cerulean. And the reason you're wearing a cerulean sweater is because in 2002, Oscar de la Renta showed cerulean on the runway. A few years later, Yves Saint Laurent showed cerulean military jackets. In the 5 years after, multiple designers started using cerulean. And then that eventually filtered down into the sweaters from which you chose. And the value of that scene, and I would encourage anybody to go on YouTube and watch it, is it makes it very clear that something that we tend to think of as personal, as much as what you're wearing, you choose what you're wearing, is ultimately shaped by the world around you. That Andy's choice of a cerulean sweater, yes, it was her choice, but it was her choice from a very constrained choice set that was created for her by the world around her. And this is the world that now we're beginning to dawn to. It's a world of physical choices made for us, algorithmic choices made for us. And the world's always been like that, and the world's always going to be like that. And this is not an argument against that. This is simply an argument that says, once we recognize that, then we should make sure that our choices privilege health, that our choice set privileges health. And unless we do that, we're bound for failure. So the positive is, once you recognize this, let's create choice sets that privilege health. And if we do not do that, we are going to have the kind of conditions we have in the United States today. Now, we have done this before, and there are good examples of success. Perhaps the biggest example of success is one of the biggest health triumphs in this country in the past century, which is our decline in motor vehicle deaths. So the blue line going down is deaths from car accidents. The green line is how much we drive. We drive much more, we die less. Per vehicle mile driven, we die about 200 times less per every vehicle mile driven. We have earned for ourselves the freedom from dying unexpectedly in our cars. Now, how did we do that? Well, if choosing people to be healthy was the approach, we would have done that by choosing to create healthier drivers. Now, I'm from Boston. I'm not from out here on the West Coast, so I'm not sure what drivers are like on the West Coast, but I can tell you that in Boston, people are not better drivers than they were 100 years ago. No, but everybody knows how we've done this. We've done this through agreeing on seatbelts and airbags and shatterproof glass and against incentives against driving while under the influence of alcohol. That's how we've done it. So we have created a world where the choice set of healthy driving is now constrained in the direction of not hurting each other. That's how we've done it. And that really has to be the metaphor for how we create health in all aspects. Point 3. If you really buy this argument, and perhaps the comment that I'm faced most often since I've done this book when I talk to different audiences is, well, this argument you're making is kind of obvious. And I actually really enjoy that comment, because I feel like if the argument's obvious, it means it's intuitive, which means we can actually act on it. We need to understand that it's the world around us that generates health. And in order for us to be healthy, we need to actually invest in the world around us. And I want to tell you a story to explain that. And this is a picture of what a couple of years ago was the best soccer team in the United States, which is the US women's national soccer team that won the World Cup. Now, soccer is the only sport I care about, so this is a very personal story. But I understand that people in the audience may or may not know this, and I know people from outside the US who call it football, which is its real name. But for those who don't know the sport, it's very simple. You have 11 people on one side, 11 on the other side, and they sort of kick the ball with their feet, hence it's football, and try to get the ball into the other net. That's how the game works. It's a very simple game, which is why it's the most popular game in the world. Now, if you don't know the game, just so you understand, the 10 players in blue, they can only use their feet. The one player in red, she can use all parts of her body to stop the ball from going to the net. So if you don't play soccer, sometimes the mistake that we make is to say, well, if you have the world's best goalie, you're always going to win, because she can stop any ball from going to the net. But if you watch a professional soccer game, what you'll see, you would see here with Hope Solo, she's now retired, the goalie prowls her area for the entire game, and she's yelling at the other players. You know what she's yelling at them to do? She's saying, keep the ball away from me. Because the good goalie knows that the net is big. It doesn't matter how good she is. A fastball coming at the net is going to go in. Now, why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because you want a good goalie. But a good goalie by herself does not win the game. The goalie is medicine. The goalie is healthcare. The goalie is what we have to look after us if we get sick. And we want a good goalie, right? As I said at the beginning, I want to be treated for my malaria. I want to be treated for my heart attack. But the goalie by herself is not going to win the game. You need the other 10 players. And the other 10 players are the places we live, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat. They are whether the environment around us encourages us to smoke, use substances, the houses we live in, the parks that we have for recreation, the education that we have that teaches us and puts us on a path towards healthier living, the economic opportunities we have, whether or not there is violence that we're exposed to, whether or not there is equity between genders. Those are the pillars that ultimately generate health. And that's what creates the soccer team that wins at health. And what are those pillars? Here's examples. Early childhood education. We can spend $5. We know that we save $5 for every dollar we spend in early childhood education. We reduce crime, child maltreatment, teen pregnancy. We know this. Public transportation. We know that in a city of 1 million people, a 40% expansion of public transit has an annual health benefit of more than $200 million. And incomes. We know that things like earned income tax credits, increasing earned income tax credits for low-income families by 10%, reduces infant mortality by 23 per 100,000. Or put another way is it saves 23 infant deaths for every 100,000 infants born. So we know this. I mean, I'm just showing you 3 concrete examples. And these are data you can find on the web. You can actually go on the CDC website. You'll find these data. These are all from the CDC itself. And we know that investment in these other 10 pillars ultimately generate health. And what we keep forgetting is that investing in these other 10 pillars is non-discretionary. We actually have no choice but to invest in them if we want to generate health, as is perhaps evident by the abysmal state of health in this country, despite the extraordinary investment that we make, because all that investment is going on just one of the players, namely the goalie. So the bottom line. So here's the bottom line. Here's the takeaway from this presentation, and really the takeaway from the book. I would urge us all to remember 3 things. 3 things are as follows. Number 1, what killed Blind Willie Johnson? What choices we are really making, and why we need to invest in more than the goalie. What killed Blind Willie Johnson was the combination of circumstances in his life that generated health. It was his housing, his poverty, racism, domestic violence, poor access to care. The choices we are really making. We think that we are choosing our healthy behaviors, but in fact, our behaviors are constrained by the same world around us that ultimately killed Blind Willie Johnson. And number 3, if we want to create health, we need to invest in much more than malaria, much more than the goalie. Once we understand that, I think it fundamentally changes how we talk about health, and it puts us on a path towards a much healthier world. And I will stop with just one last slide, and then I'll take questions. This is sort of what the book is trying to get at, and really the point of the book is the subtitle, which is what we need to talk about when we talk about health. Because what I'm trying to do with the book is I am trying to say we need to change our conversation on health. Once we change our conversation on health, a lot of other things follow. And our fundamental problem right now is that we do not understand Blind Willie Johnson's story. We do not understand Devil Wears Prada. And we do not understand how soccer is played and how soccer can actually help us win at health. That's it. I'll stop there. I will take questions, comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Galea. I think in your book you also touched on how unique the American culture is around individualism and about individual choice, and you just touched on it as well during your presentation. Is health and this fixation on the individual choice and individualism fundamentally contradictory? Because I think it seems like there is some kind of fundamental assessment that we have to do amongst ourselves.
Yeah, no, it's a terrific question. The answer is I don't think they are at all. I don't think Americans are any different than the Irish, the Italians, the Swedish, the Zambians. I think at core, Americans want to be healthy. I think we make a mistake in the American conversation in this notion of we want freedom. It's part of the national conversation, right? Freedom. Freedom is a core part of what it is to be American. But when you look carefully at the canonical texts, at what started the country, there are different kinds of freedoms. There's freedom to do things, and there's freedom from things. And in the past 30, 40 years, we have privileged freedom to over freedom from. You want freedom from dying unexpectedly when you leave this building. That is a freedom. You want freedom from getting obese without thinking about it because you're constantly eating calorie-dense, nutrient-poor foods that are there because of subsidies for products that are unhealthy. And that is also freedom. So I do not think it's in contradiction. I actually think that we have allowed ourselves to get into a place where we privilege one type of freedom over another. And I think that's simply a mistake in our national conversation.
Hi, I'm curious to hear your views on like drug decriminalization in light of what you said about choice sets and things to motivate behavior.
Yeah, I think the moves towards drug decriminalization are enormously long overdue. The criminalization of drugs in this country has had such a disproportionate effect on particularly on people of color, particularly young black men, that it has created a whole wave of incarceration and downstream consequences that I actually think that we are still haven't fully come to grips with the full scale of the physical, mental health consequences of incarceration, which is directly linked to criminalization of drugs. So I think decriminalization is long overdue. I also think that decriminalization, leaving aside now the burden that criminalization has imposed upon a particular group, decriminalization creates an opportunity for regulation. It creates an opportunity for drugs to be purchased and sold in a way that controls them. It creates an opportunity for us to create a system where the ingestion of those drugs happens such a way that people are not hurting themselves. And that, of course, is something we can never do if drugs are criminalized. Now, the argument often about decriminalization is, well, people can still buy drugs illegally. That's true, but there's ample historical precedent to show that most people, most of the time, would rather do things that are legal than do things that are illegal. Once you decriminalize drugs, people will be buying those substances through legal means. So thank you, it's a good question.
I'm gonna paraphrase a virtual Dory question. So this person is saying that a similar approach needs to be used regarding our justice system and mass incarceration, also contributor mortality health. We focus on eradicating crime, aka disease, rather than creating strong, safe communities, aka health. So I guess I wanted to kind of phrase it more in a question of what role should community take a broader role, or do you think it's really just just like a shaping the conversation, shaping the national like rhetoric?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question. I think the answer I should give is to say that community should take a role, but I want to be careful when I say that. I think it's just too easy an answer. To paraphrase Margaret Thatcher, of all people, Margaret Thatcher said, she meant it differently, obviously, but there's no such thing as community, there are only people. And I actually think that there is some cynical wisdom to that, because community is us. I mean, community populations are collections of people that have their own emergent properties that behave differently than individuals do. But they do remain collections of people. So I do think that communities behave in a way that its constituent citizens, us, push the conversation forward. There is a recent set of papers that talk about what percent of people in a given country do you need to create real change, and the science seems to be heading in the direction if you have more than 3.5% of people who demand real change, change always happens. The 3.5% in the US is 10 million people. It's not that many people. So I do think that this rests on a national conversation shift and a global conversation shift. For those of you who are following from other countries who are feeling smug about it, it's probably not so wise, because unfortunately there are abundant examples, national examples in other countries that are following a lot of the path that the US has paved on this, and the US path is definitely not emulable. So I do think that it comes down to people, comes down to citizens, comes down to citizens demanding health and citizens understanding health and demanding health by demanding that we build the structures to generate health.
A lot of people sometimes are skeptical of experts like you because there has been a lot of distrust of experts and of facts and of because I think a lot of people presently in poor health and in poor situations can only help but view that essentially people who or in positions of power failed us, and I fail to trust people who spout knowledge and expertise. I'm sure that's part of the reason why there are many parents who refuse to vaccinate their children. So could you is this potentially related? Could you speak on this? Because I think there would be a lot of people who would say, oh, well, they're just trying to tell me how to live my life.
Yeah, so I think it seems to me appropriate to be suitably skeptical of experts. That's fine. That seems reasonable. I think taking the American lens for a second, the American woeful underperformance on health has had deep and devastating consequences for the national political scene. And by that, I don't mean as a partisan comment. I mean it in terms of fracturing the national political conversation. So I could show you data, which I have on my laptop, but I'm not showing it here, that looks at the counties in the US that lost life expectancy up to 2016. And you could correlate those data with the counties in the US that were likeliest to vote for Donald Trump. And it is a dose response is a straight line. The counties that lost life expectancy were more likely to vote for Donald Trump. Now, if you think about it, and I hope this is not taken as a partisan comment, you had two candidates running in the last US election. One candidate who was the party of the incumbent, who essentially said, we're doing well and we're going to do better. Another candidate who said, I'm not a politician. I don't like anything that's happening. I'm going to change all that and throw everything out. Now, leaving aside how you feel about both candidates, leaving aside their personal characteristics, it seems to me that if you are living in a county where you've seen your life expectancy go down, it is not unreasonable to vote for the candidate who says, everything's going to hell in a handbasket. I'm going to change all of that. Whether you believe that he can actually do it, whether or not he's actually done it is irrelevant. So the point I'm making is that our health underperformance has had seismic impact on the American political conversation, and in many respects this trickled down to the global political conversation. So I do think that there is hell to pay for the fact that we have let this sneak upon us. And we are, I should be clear, today in a worse position than we're in when I started to write this book. So I'm not sure how many viewers will know this, but in 2018, 2017, 2016, and there was a decrease in life expectancy in the US. That was the first time we had a year-on-year, 3-year decrease in life expectancy since the 1918 flu pandemic. So for 100 years, we have not had the poor health indicators that we're having now. So it is reasonable, it is very reasonable for people to say, I don't trust experts. This is where they got us to. We are in a not a good place on health. Having said that, the reason we're not in a good place is because we collectively are not talking about health the right way.
Thank you for coming to speak, Dr. Galea. I had a question regarding the bar charts that you had comparing the contributing factors to our health outcomes and the amount of spending that we have on healthcare. I believe the largest contributing factor was personal health choices in terms of health outcomes. My question for you there is, one, how did you determine that that was the largest contributing factor, or that overall chart overall? And secondly, what do you think are the obstacles, or what is hindering people in terms of finding the information they need to make better personal health choices?
Yeah, so the calculation of those percentages is always very difficult. It's an attributable fraction calculation, which ultimately it ultimately blurs the fact that these are multiple causes that all occur and all contribute at the same time. So we have to be careful about being too rigid and saying it's 30%, 32%. It's I would think of it more as a way to organize our thinking about what the major contributors to health are. Because ultimately personal choices, as I've indicated, are nested within the environments which we're in. So saying that you choose to eat healthy food is ultimately directly driven by the fact that you're surrounded by healthy food, right? So the two are not separable. The information, I think, is critical in terms of health behavior, but it is necessary, but nowhere near sufficient. And I think one of the mistakes we make in our sort of digital conversation and in our being enraptured by all things digital is that we think that information by itself is sufficient. It's simply not, and there's abundant data on that. I mean, I can show you, for example, data that there's been this wave of personalized genetic testing, and one of the premises of it is that, well, if I know what my genotype is and what I'm more at risk for, I'm going to change my health behavior. The data are pretty clear. It doesn't happen. Actually, I do not change my health behavior. So information is necessary, but nowhere near sufficient. So this is, again, it's a bit of an and argument. It's not an argument against information. It's not an argument that says we need structures that create stable, healthy behavior sets versus information. Not at all. I think we need both, but information by itself is not enough.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just to your right, I think.
I had two, thanks for the wonderful talk. I had two questions.
Yeah.
One is, I was curious how the bar charts might appear in other countries that are doing sort of better on a smaller portion of their expenses.
Yeah, the contributing factors to health don't change. They really are, they're human universal. What does changes is what countries spend their money on. So I've said in this talk consistently that we spend more on health than other countries. It would be reasonable for you to say that that's wrong. We actually don't spend more on health. We spend more on healthcare. When you look at our spending on these other pillars that I'm talking about, which is the housing, the education, the economic opportunities, when you look at that spending, we far underspend our peers. So when you add those two, if you take my soccer metaphor and you say, what are we spending on the whole team? We are spending substantially less on the whole team compared to countries that do much better than we do on health. So in some respects, the spending and the outcome is well matched.
So on the left side, that would have been
That's pretty
unchanged
universal.
relative
Correct.
to
That's
the
the right side
other
of the figures.
countries. The right side,
Correct.
they would have had more than, instead of just 5% on the bottom on other factors,
Correct.
that would have been higher.
Correct.
And my second thing I was curious about is, to what extent do you find it useful and informative to break down the US into different, say, socioeconomic categories or something, and how do the curves look if you do that? Does that, is that a useful?
Yeah, it doesn't change. It doesn't change very much. Now, there are many different socioeconomic patterns across the country, and in fact, there's been some papers that have been done dividing up the U.S. into 8 different groupings of states. There's many different ways in which we can divide up the country, but the things that don't change are as follows. Number one is, in terms of those 2 bars you're referring to, what causes health doesn't change, and what we spend on health does not change. I live in Boston and Massachusetts. Boston is the city in the country which has the highest doctor population ratio. It is a city where health is the primary employer. So sometimes I give a talk like this in Boston, and I get challenged on that and says, well, surely Boston is different. And I can show data in Massachusetts that shows that in the past 15 years, we have increased our spending on medical care by about 80%, and we have kept the same or decreased our spending on parks and recreation, on mental health, on public health efforts, on criminal justice, domestic violence. All of that's gone down or stayed the same. So even in Massachusetts, which, by the way, I mentioned Hawaii is the healthiest state, Massachusetts is the second healthiest state. So even in Massachusetts, we are underperforming this set of factors, which explains why even Hawaii and Massachusetts have worse health indicators than, say, Slovenia and all the countries above Slovenia.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
I have a question about, for each individual, should we try out all the trending diets and health advices flowing around in the internet, such as keto diet, or should we just stick to the most basic, less is more concept, just being stable?
I think you should stick to the most basic, because the truth about all these diets is some will work, some won't, some will make a difference, some won't. But the difference is around the edges. What really matters is ultimately the choice set and the individual eating healthy consistently over a lifetime. So going to the keto diet or the Atkins diet or whatever, it's sort of irrelevant. What really matters is that you eat a variety of things, you get enough nutrients, you eat in moderation, and you do that consistently throughout a lifetime. And most humans have a really hard time doing that, in large part because we do not surround them with healthy foods consistently over a lifetime. So I would say, ignore all that, eat reasonably, eat broadly over a lifetime. That's what you need to do.
And then to just kind of bring, the question home here at Google.
Please.
So in your research, how have you found technological advances playing a part as your bar charts increase or decrease? How
Sure.
have you seen that?
I like technology. I think technology has brought some wonderful things to our changing our life, although it never changes our life as quickly as we think it does. Otherwise, we'd be driving around in flying cars today. I think the mistake that we make is into thinking that technology is a solution for fundamental problems. And this goes a little bit to my answer that I gave about information being necessary but not sufficient. I think technology is a terrific adjunct to improving our quality of life, towards creating opportunities for us to live healthy for as long as possible. And but it is by itself, it is not sufficient. And the mistake that we make is if we think that technology is going to be the only solution. And there's plenty of people sort of who've written about this. And I think it requires humility on the part of all of us that that technology is simply part of the solution. But at the end of the day, technology is not going to deal with domestic violence, not going to deal with with housing, it's not going to deal with all economic opportunities, it's not going to deal with gender equity, it's not going to deal with early childhood education. It's an adjunct to all of those, but by itself is not enough. So I do think that we need to make sure that we see technology as in its place. And to go back to my soccer metaphor, I think technological advances and developments that create opportunities for, let's call it a more sophisticated form of living that allows us to do more, is one of the players on the soccer team. And I'm okay with that. And I think it's important that one of the players on the soccer team, as long as we don't make the mistake thinking that if we invest everything in player number 7 being technology, we're going to win the game, because we're not.
So you believe more in technological aids rather than solutions?
I think, well, it depends what you mean by solutions. If by solutions, my argument is not whether technology is a solution or not. My argument is whether it is a sufficient solution. So I would stick with my soccer metaphor. I think player 7 can score, but she's not going to win by herself. She needs the other 10 players, and technology is one of the 10 players.
I guess to ask one final question, which is kind of a good final question. This person wants to know what we at the individual level can do to help change the system and the environment. Is it to, next time we go out to a bar, like start the conversation?
Yes, that's great. So I will I will give 3 things. Number 1, yes, go to a bar, go to dinner, and tell 10 people about this talk. If everybody tells 10 people and tell them to tell 10 people, that will get us to the 10 million people who understand the conversation. That's number 1. That's number 1. Number two, vote for candidates who understand this. Vote for people for positions of authority in the public sector who understand what it is that it takes to generate health. And that could be at the local level, at the municipal level, at the state level, at the federal level. Number 3, be a part of and support and encourage the private sector that is willing to generate the conditions that generate health. So I think those 3: change the conversation, vote for people in public office who understand this, and number 3, create conditions in the private sector by supporting elements of the private sector that understand this discussion. With thank you to Google for allowing me to present that message.
Thank you very much for giving your wonderful lecture.
Thank you for having me.